Well, thank you so much, Valerie, for that introduction and the framing. It's my privilege to introduce our speakers for the Chafee panel today. Sherry Mitchell is the founding director of the Land Peace Foundation and an Indigenous rights activist, lawyer, author, teacher, and amazing transformational change maker. Dr. Darren Ranco is chair of Native American Programs, coordinator of Native American Research, and associate professor of anthropology at the University of Maine. And they are both citizens of the Penobscot Nation. It's my real honor to speak with them today. We want to really begin a conversation about the potential, the benefits, the challenges, and what we really need to reflect on much more deeply as we look at bringing together Indigenous and Western knowledge systems to enable much better and stronger decision-making and solutions and approaches to climate change. So I wanted to start with Sherry. You had an essay published recently in the climate anthology, All We Can Save. And you were referencing, and really actually a challenge to Western science to see beyond the confines of its inherent biases and to overcome hierarchical, reductionist, and compartmentalized thinking in order to see a much more holistic, the patterns that are present throughout everything. And you had also mentioned that mainstream thinkers will need to be courageous enough to challenge the barriers that have prevented Indigenous knowledge from coming forward more fully. So I wondered if you could start somewhere in there and help us to understand what some of that context and what those barriers are.
As you said, the challenge for science, I think, has always been to see beyond their implicit bias, to be able to look at the history of the rise of science and the framework in which it has risen. We look at science and so many people think that this is the ultimate truth, that science cannot be questioned. And what we're asking those within the scientific community to do, to consider, is the possibility that the framework that you have risen up within is in some ways flawed, that there is implicit bias attached to that framework that prevents scientists from looking beyond this kind of fragmented view, but also a view that creates a power structure and has been complicit in creating a power structure that purposely excludes other voices and certainly excludes the voices of those who have been marginalized. And so when we're talking about the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge into a scientific framework, it's going to require scientists to look beyond their compartmentalized, fragmented views into a more holistic, world-centric view, universal-centric view of life, of the larger creation that we're all a part of, and to begin to recognize key relationships that exist among and between all living systems, and the many ways that these systems are constantly moving toward harmony. Living systems do not exist as a snapshot in time. They exist as a constantly moving organism that's moving toward wholeness. It's moving toward harmony, moving toward greater cooperation with the other systems around. And so, you know, being able to look at things from that perspective, which is a very Indigenous perspective. It's the way that we have always done our scientific research into the systems that we live in relationship with. So we have collected data in much the same way that science has. We just view it from a different lens. And so we have observed for millennia. We have engaged with and interacted with and experimented with all of the living systems that are around us, so that we have a greater understanding of how those systems work and how we work in relationship to those systems. And though the lens is different by which we view the research that we're doing, it doesn't make it any less valid. And so, you know, I think the first step towards creating this merging of traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge into the mainstream scientific community is really, it's going to be an issue of ego and control. And so letting go of the need to be, I'm the one who has all of the power here. I'm the one who is right. My knowledge base is bigger than your knowledge base. My knowledge base is more right than your knowledge base because I'm part of the system that has been dominantly promoted for centuries, and start really accessing the full spectrum of information that's available to us. And I think that when we have people within the scientific community who are courageous enough to acknowledge that they don't know everything, we're going to start really knowing something collectively. I think that's the greatest challenge for science right now, is to overcome that implicit bias of superiority, an implicit bias of omnipotence, and also, the implicit bias that says that knowledge gained in other ways is inferior to the knowledge that you have, because time and time again, Indigenous peoples have said, this is how this works. This is what this impacts. This is how we engage with these systems and how they move over time. And science has dismissed that as being, magical thinking. But then 50 to 100 years later, in some cases 300 years later, scientists are coming back and saying, oh my God, this works exactly the way the Indigenous peoples have said that it had worked all along. We could have saved 300 years, right? We could have saved 50 years. We could have saved 10,000 lives. And so when we're looking at the ways that we move in relation to understanding whole systems, that has to be part of the equation. Otherwise, we miss entire spectrum of information that's available to us.
Darren, did you want to also add something? And
Absolutely. Although Sherry is always hard to follow, I'm a little bit more in the belly of the beast of as being in an academic institution. And I'd really like to just build on the many themes that Sherry laid out. I like to think about these as sort of zones of engagement that are required to move this forward, to actually, in a serious way, center Indigenous knowledge, perspectives, experience in the context of a higher education context. But I think we also do, research. We do a lot of different elements to it. So I kind of break it down into three areas: institutional issues, research issues, and pedagogical issues. I'll start with the institutional ones, and Sherry brought that up, this idea of a need for a reckoning. It has to be addressed at a structural or institutional level for this work to really begin. I think it needs to be part of a larger consciousness. Sometimes we refer to this as decolonization work in the academy, but I think it's more directly just addressing this past of, we as Indigenous people have been the objects of research, but we have never been the managers of it, right? That we've never been central to the role. And I think that would mean institutions really thinking collaboratively with Indigenous people. Why would Indigenous people even want to be a part of your quote unquote study institution, given this past? So here at the University of Maine, over the last decade since I've been here, we've really tried to address those through both formal and informal means. I think we have formal agreements like MOUs around managing and co-managing cultural heritage items that the university has in its collections, but inviting in Indigenous people to co-manage and in some ways reclaim things that are rightfully Indigenous holdings. We have ways of permanently reinscribing indigeneity and Indigenous places on our campus. You see the sign behind me, right? There are a whole host of our signage on campus centers Indigenous worldview and language. And I'm I'm always critical of sort of surfacey types of things. I think this, as opposed to sometimes land acknowledgements or other kinds of fleeting words, this does reorient people to understand they are indigenous spaces, right, as they walk across our campus. So there's a lot of obviously providing resources in a serious way. It's, treating this as broad and critical priority for the institution. It's not, it's not the icing on the cake of the work of the institution, but it's the cake itself. It's a critical part of what the institution does. And too often, the diversity, equity, inclusion work, which I think is also important, that if it just gets set, the same work but with brown faces, that's not the goals of this institutional work. So I think of that as part of a space clearing, where you could say that's a little bit of opening up a possibility for the other two issues, one of which is research. So before I get to Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous science as it relates to this research, again, dealing with this legacy of colonial research structures, extractive research structures, reversing that flow. A lot of us engage in what we call Indigenous research methods. Indigenous research methods center Indigenous people and perspectives through research, but also it's not merely the inclusion of Indigenous people in a research project. It is literally a project that first and foremost is designed by Indigenous people in collaboration with Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. So who gets to ask a question and what that question is being determined by Indigenous people, is the very first step of those Indigenous research methods. And then the last zone, and this is in some ways the most challenging zone, has to do with the pedagogy, how science is taught and presented to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. How does one really center Indigenous science traditions alongside Western science? And I do believe that that's the goal here. We have the Wabanaki Youth Science Program, the WAYS program, that started out as a middle and high school Native youth STEM education program. And we've always centered both Indigenous science and Western science. Our relations in Canada, here in Maine and across Canada, Eastern Canada, the Mi'kmaq have developed this idea of two-eyed seeing. Albert Marshall and others in Nova Scotia have really thought about the benefits of Indigenous science traditions and Western science traditions coming together through the two eyes approach. That's where you can see more fully. And really bringing that together is a huge challenge, only because the way we teach science is so structured and so slanted in one direction, and it's really hard to change. Even as we've been developing our WAYS program, and as we moved it in a couple of years ago, we got an NSF grant to move it into the University of Maine setting. Our research shows that obviously the purpose of the program was to have more Native students in STEM education programs and graduating and into STEM careers. But we've also found that, of course, this shouldn't be a surprise to a lot of you who are watching this today, non-Native students benefit from the inclusion of Indigenous science in their STEM classrooms. The Sami scholar Rana Kuwakinen talks about, in reckoning with this rationality of like, why would we ever, after education has represented forced assimilation and extractive research, why would we ever participate in these kinds of institutions? And she really uses the notion of hospitality, and that is a critical part of who we are as Indigenous people, and that mutual respect of, we are all in this together, and recognizing that, and really imparting upon and asking scientists to also think about exchanges and hospitalities, that, when you invite someone into your institution, what is it that you're offering them, and how are you making them at home and centering who they are and their experience. That creates the beginning, I think, the beginnings of some real profound relationships. And, one of the, great lessons from elders, so many that I've learned, that treating each other first as your heart and your recognition of being a human, cuts across cultures, races, experiences. But as Sherry mentioned, that's a real challenge to the ways in which these legacy hierarchies manifest themselves in places like universities, research institutes.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations with you, and to listen to the knowledge that you've gained through your years of being in the belly of that beast. I think that one of the things that is important to me as Skidginaway Apit, as an Indigenous woman, as a mother and a grandmother, is really understanding and living in accordance with this way of life that our ancestors have passed down to us for millennia, that's allowed us to live here. There's evidence of our people going back on this land tens of thousands of years here in the Northeast, at least 15,000. We believe much, much more than that. Hearing these stories that they have shared with us through this way of life that we call Skidginaway B'Mousewagan. It's this way of life that's living in harmony, walking in balance with what lives around you and who lives around you. And there are these two very specific cultural values that I talk about quite frequently in the work that I do, Mama Bizu and Ala Bizu. And Mama Bizu means I have enough. Somebody asks you, personally, if you have enough. That's Mama Bizu. And I have enough to live my life with a sense of security and a sense of dignity. I have, enough shelter, food, care, sense of belonging. I have enough water. I have all of the things that I need to be whole and well in the world. And the term Ala Bizu is referring to everyone having enough. And we recognize that we can't say definitively that we have enough. We can't be declaring that we have enough in Mama Bizu if Ala Bizu is not also true. Because we recognize that our ties to our community and the well-being of the entire community is part of the equation of our own wellness. Then the community being whole and having enough to live with dignity and a sense of security is also necessary to our sense of well-being. And so when we're thinking about the decisions that are being made on a larger scale in regard to right now, as we're doing this video, Enbridge Line 3 is being placed through the Rising Lakes in Minnesota, right through Ojibwe territory, and under the Mississippi River. Every single tar sands pipeline that's ever been built has leaked, every single one. They're corrosive. You need a much higher level of pressure because of the viscosity of what's being pushed through the pipes. And they have this deteriorative element as a result of the additives that are put into the oil, the bitumen. And so when you're dealing with highly toxic chemicals being pumped through and into waterways, because they will eventually end up in those waterways, and those decisions are being backed by science, there's no consideration of Mama Bizu and Ala Bizu being balanced in that scenario. There's no consideration that the whole community, which means all living beings within that ecosystem, not just the human beings, although there's certainly no consideration for the human beings that live along those waterways. All that's being considered in this very narrow framework is how do we meet our own ends to the detriment of all other living beings that we are living in relationship with or in relative space with. And so if we don't have this ethic and this this core value within the framework of what we're doing, then we have lost our humanity. Then our work has lost its compassion and its care for life. These are not things that we leave at the door when we enter into our workspace. This fragmentation of ourselves, in addition to the fragmentation in the way that we see our world, this fragmentation of ourselves is one of the most critical flaws of our time, that we have learned to set aside that which we value most. We have learned to set aside the ethical guiding principles that have helped us to, come up in the world as human beings. We have set aside the very things that make us human in order to advance and to progress along these streams of capitalism. And right now, one of the most flawed aspects of science is the fact that its history and its contemporary representations in the world are largely based to capitalist venture. And so it's not science for the sake of science, it's science for the sake of advancement of some capitalist ideal. That is not tied to an ethical value structure. That's not tied to anything other than the promotion of capacity for developing profit. When we take the value of life and make it secondary to the value of money, we've already all lost. And we see the implications of that now on a global scale with climate change, where the value of profit over human lives, and certainly over the life of our planet and the life of all other living beings within our individual systems, ecosystems, and environments, has led to a rate of extinction that has put every life on the line. We're facing this sixth major extinction, right? We have 1 million species currently under threat of extinction. And, despite what the UN report says, human beings are one of those species. And that's only going to change if we change the ways that we're engaging in the work that we're doing. And if we have, like I said before, like you mentioned, Laura, if we have the courage to do the right thing, if we have the courage to survive, do we have the courage to survive as human beings? Or are we going to cower our way to death? I mean, that's the decision that we have to make right now in the face of these systems that have been created that have held all of the power. Our scientific communities have certainly been under fire over the last few years, and many have courageously stood up to the denial of science. And now there's another step on that ladder of courage that needs to be taken in order for us to actually come to a place where we're going to be able to sustain life in the future.
I think as we work with Western scientists and Indigenous scientists and knowledge keepers to do this work, we're really mindful that the obligations of the knowledge, and that it can create different pathways for Western scientists and policymakers too to think differently. From a Wabanaki lens, the border doesn't exist, right? Seeing this and not treating the zone of action as a nation state or even a state or whatever, seeing the interconnections between people and humans and non-humans and how that shapes our understanding of one another in our ecologies, can really open up different zones of action, both as in science and policy. And I think, too often we, I understand the power of the nation state, don't get me wrong. But I do believe that thinking across these boundaries into ecologies that we as Indigenous people have helped shape and that have shaped us is a really different way of approaching this work. If you think about just access to fresh water, fresh clean water, and for our Native communities here and in Canada, I mean, these basic things are already not being addressed adequately, and it's only going to get worse if we don't collectively act.